Aisha took a long breath while looking at the wall clock hanging above the entrance of the supermarket. It was almost 3 in the afternoon, but today felt longer than usual. The hustle and bustle of customers coming and going, shuffling items in their shopping carts without much conversation, made Aisha feel like a small cog in a big machine. This supermarket was her little world, filled with shelves of the same products every day. Yet somehow there was always something new happening within it. As she served a mother with a fussy young child, Aisha could feel her back starting to ache. It felt like the day would never end. The mother gave an awkward smile when her child began to cry for not being allowed to take candy from the checkout rack. Aisha could only offer a thin smile, completing the transaction and hoping she wouldn't have to deal with more customers like that before her shift ended. However, as she glanced toward the entrance, she noticed something that instantly made her stomach churn. Jake, the police officer who often stopped by the supermarket, had just walked in. His confident face and neat uniform were familiar to Aisha, but recently Jake's presence made her feel uneasy. Not because he was a police officer, but because of how Jake treated her every time they interacted. His gaze lingered too long, too sharply. There was something strange in the way Jake approached her, as if there were hidden intentions behind his smiles and sweet words. Jake walked toward the drink aisle, grabbed a bottle of soda, and then casually made his way to Aisha's checkout counter. Ever since Jake started appearing at the supermarket, Aisha could sense that something was off. At first, Jake was just a regular customer, but in recent weeks, his visits had increased suspiciously, more often than what was normal for someone just buying drinks or snacks. "Hey Aisha, how's your day?" Jake flashed a wide smile as he placed the soda bottle on the counter. His eyes were sharp, as if assessing Aisha's reaction. Aisha offered a brief smile, trying to remain as formal as possible. "Good, thank you. Do you need anything else besides this?" "No, just this," Jake replied, his voice sounding relaxed, but there was a certain tone that made Aisha feel uneasy. "Looks like it's a bit busy today." "Huh?" Aisha nodded, quickly scanning the soda bottle. "Yeah, it's pretty busy." They chatted about trivial things for a while, but every time Jake spoke, Aisha felt there was something behind his words, something more than just small talk. The way he looked at her felt invasive, as if he was trying to read deeper than Aisha wanted to show. Aisha always maintained her professional demeanor, but she knew Jake didn't see her as just a cashier. Each time Jake came in, a sense of anxiety began to gnaw at her mind. "Why don't you ever want to talk longer with me?" Jake suddenly asked, his voice a bit pressuring, though he still wore the same smile. The question jolted Aisha. For a moment, she could see something in Jake's eyes, something she had avoided seeing all this time. "Sorry, I'm just busy. There are a lot of customers," Aisha replied, hoping her tone sounded neutral. She didn't want to provoke Jake or offend him, but deep down she knew there was a growing tension every time Jake appeared. Jake chuckled softly, but this time his laugh didn't sound as comfortable as before. "Oh, surely you can spare a little time to chat, right? We've seen each other often." Aisha offered a stiff smile and completed the transaction, handing over the change with trembling hands that she tried to hide. "Thank you for shopping here." Jake stared at her for a moment, then took the soda bottle and change. Before leaving, he said in a more serious tone, "I'll stop by again later." Aisha felt her body tense after Jake left the supermarket. His short yet meaningful words made her heart race faster than usual. Something was off, and she didn't know what to do. Jake was a police officer, and she knew that anyone who tried to stand up to a cop could get into serious trouble. But Aisha also understood that she couldn't let this feeling haunt her every time Jake showed up. After Jake left, Aisha tried to refocus on her work, but her mind kept swirling around the earlier encounter. It seemed like this problem was just beginning, and for some reason Aisha felt the days ahead would be much more difficult than just an ordinary cashier shift. 2 weeks before Aisha truly realized something was wrong, Jake first appeared in the supermarket with an ordinary impression. At that time, he was just a man in a police uniform shopping, like any other customer. Aisha remembered that it was a typical Friday afternoon, not too crowded, and the dry summer air caused some people to choose to stay indoors to avoid the scorching sun. Jake came in with a wide smile, carrying a small basket filled with a few items. Aisha's glance quickly passed over his face. There was nothing special about him at that moment. Police officers often visited this supermarket to buy drinks or snacks while on duty. So, Aisha didn't pay much attention to him, just considering him an ordinary customer who stopped by for a moment. "Good afternoon, how's your day?" Jake said warmly as he arrived at Aisha's counter. His voice was low and confident, with a sense of familiarity, as if they had known each other for a long time, even though to Aisha, he was just a stranger doing his shopping. "Good afternoon, fine," Aisha replied briefly while starting to scan Jake's items. She continued her work without much conversation, as usual. She wasn't the type of person who enjoyed lengthy chats with customers unless necessary. For her, this job was a way to make a living, not a social gathering. Jake watched her closely, but Aisha didn't care much. After the transaction was completed, Jake smiled again and said, "Thank you, maybe we'll see each other often. I like stopping by here." Aisha just nodded and offered a polite, thin smile, not thinking much of it. After all, customers who said such things usually came and went, just empty promises without meaning. After Jake left, Aisha continued her day without realizing that it was the beginning of something bigger and more dangerous. A few days after that first encounter, Jake returned. This time he came in more casually without his police uniform, but with the same sharp gaze. Aisha saw him from a distance as he entered, and this time, a sense of discomfort began to grow within her. She still remembered Jake's face, but she tried to act normally. However, when Jake approached her checkout counter, Aisha felt the atmosphere around them shift. "Hi, Aisha," he greeted casually while placing several items on the counter. Aisha was slightly surprised to hear her name mentioned. She didn't remember telling Jake what her name was, and this made her feel uneasy. "Hi," she replied briefly, starting to scan Jake's items. Jake smiled widely, clearly enjoying the situation. "You don't remember me, do you? I stopped by last week when I was in uniform." "Oh, right. The police officer, right?" Aisha answered in a flat tone, not wanting to show the discomfort she was starting to feel. She sensed something strange in the way Jake spoke. The man was clearly trying to approach her beyond just a typical cashier-customer relationship. Jake chuckled lightly, his voice deep. "Yeah, that's right. But now I'm just Jake. We don't need to be formal, right?" Aisha shrugged, trying to focus on her work rather than this conversation. "Yeah, maybe." Jake looked at Aisha with an intense gaze, as if trying to read her mind. "Have you worked here long?" Aisha nodded briefly. "For a while. Over a year. Aisha. You must know a lot of people here. I just moved to this area, so I don't know many folks yet." Aisha only offered a thin smile, not intending to continue the conversation. But Jake seemed to miss that cue. He kept talking, trying to build a more personal chat. He began asking things like when Aisha worked, if she lived nearby, and whether she often went out during her days off. Those questions felt too personal for Aisha, and she began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. "I don't go out much. I spend more time at home," Aisha finally replied, hoping that her brief answer would end the conversation. But Jake didn't give up. "Ah, that's too bad. You should get out more, meet new people. I know some fun places in this town. If you want, I could take you there sometime." Aisha swallowed hard. His invitation sounded friendly on the surface, but his tone suggested it was more than just a casual offer. Aisha knew she couldn't outright refuse him rudely, especially since Jake was a police officer. She knew how that uniform could give him power, even outside his duties. "Thank you, but I'm busy with work," she finally replied cautiously. Jake stared at her for a moment, a thin smile appearing at the corner of his lips, but there was something behind that look. Something that made Aisha feel trapped. "Well, maybe another time. Don't be too busy, okay?" he said before finally paying and leaving. After Jake departed, Aisha felt relieved but also scared. For some reason, her intuition told her this was not the last time they would meet. And as time went on, that ominous feeling continued to haunt her. Jake seemed to be more than just an ordinary customer, and their interactions were more than just shopping small talk. There was something deeper, darker, and Aisha had no idea what would happen next. But one thing was certain: Jake didn't seem like the type to stop until he got what he wanted. Days passed. But for Aisha, the feeling of unease never truly faded since Jake began visiting more frequently. Each time she saw the supermarket doors open, her heart raced, always fearing Jake would show up again. And she was right, Jake was never really far away. The man started coming in more often, sometimes just to buy drinks, snacks, or even just to stand near the shelves, pretending to be busy browsing. But his gaze was always fixed on Aisha, making her feel as if she were being watched all the time. One afternoon, as the supermarket began to quiet down, Aisha hoped to get through the last few hours without any disturbances. The sky outside was starting to change color, signaling that the sun was almost set. The atmosphere in the supermarket became calmer, with only the sound of the ceiling fan and the soft beeping of the barcode scanner. But that tranquility didn't last long. Just as Aisha was assisting a final customer before dinner time, the automatic doors of the supermarket opened, and there stood Jake. This time he was back in his police uniform, as if he were on duty. But Aisha knew that every time Jake came here, it was never just for work. His gaze locked onto Aisha the moment he stepped in, and once again she felt that uncomfortable sensation crawling over her body. The customer Aisha was serving seemed unaware of anything amiss, but for Aisha, the air around her suddenly felt heavier. Jake walked slowly toward the cashier. There was no hurry in his steps, as if he were savoring every second spent in the same room as Aisha. Every movement was carefully planned, like an actor performing his role with precision, and Aisha was his powerless audience. "Hey Aisha," he greeted as usual. However, this time his tone was softer, as if he were trying to forge a deeper connection. Aisha managed a brief smile, though inside her fear grew stronger. "Hi Jake," she replied in a flat tone, hoping he would just buy something and leave. Jake placed several items on the counter, but his gaze remained fixated on Aisha, making her feel uneasy. "Busy again?" he asked while sliding his hands into his uniform pockets, trying to appear casual. Aisha shook her head while scanning his items. "Not too much. This evening shift is always a bit slow." Jake nodded, but his smile widened slightly, as if he were enjoying this conversation more than he should. "Good, then we can chat a bit longer." Aisha knew she couldn't avoid this chat. Every time Jake came, he always found ways to prolong their interactions, making Aisha feel increasingly trapped in an unwanted game. But this time, there was something more unsettling than usual. Jake appeared calmer, more composed, but that only heightened Aisha's fear. She could sense a hidden intent behind his friendly demeanor. "Have you worked here long?" Jake asked again, his eyes locking directly onto Aisha's, as if searching for something deeper than just an answer. Aisha nodded, trying to be as formal as possible. "Yeah, almost 2 years." Jake smiled faintly. 2 years, huh? You must know everyone here." "I'm still new to the area, so I don't know many people yet." "Do you live nearby?" That question immediately made Aisha feel threatened. This wasn't a typical conversation between a cashier and a customer. Jake was beginning to ask more personal things, topics that made Aisha feel unsafe. She hesitated for a moment before answering, trying to stay calm. "Close enough," she replied tersely, hoping that answer would be sufficient to end the conversation. But Jake didn't give up. Good, good. So you come through this area often, huh? We could hang out sometime if you want." Aisha felt cold, even though the room temperature was normal. Jake's laughter sounded like a veiled threat, and every word he spoke made the situation more chilling. Aisha didn't know how to respond without making things worse, but she knew one thing: she didn't want to be near Jake outside of this place. She couldn't bear to imagine what would happen if she found herself trapped in a situation from which she couldn't escape. "Thank you, but I rarely go out. I'm busy with work," Aisha finally replied, hoping that answer would suffice to end the conversation. However, Jake didn't relent. His gaze intensified, as if he could feel Aisha's fear and was reveling in it. "Come on, don't be too busy. Life isn't just about work, you should enjoy it too." Aisha sighed inwardly. She knew this wouldn't end easily. Every time Jake came in, he pressed Aisha further, encroaching in ways that made her feel cornered. And the scariest part was that Aisha didn't know what to do. Jake was a police officer, someone with power, someone who could create problems if he felt insulted or unappreciated. And amidst all this, Aisha was just an ordinary cashier, without protection, without power. After what felt like hours, Jake finally completed his purchase and left. But before he walked out, he paused at the door, looking back at Aisha with a knowing smile. "I'll stop by again later, okay?" Aisha didn't answer, just offered a stiff smile. After Jake left, she felt her breath returning to normal, though her heart still raced. The tension in the air gradually faded, but the uncomfortable feeling lingered. She knew Jake would be back, and each time he returned, the situation would worsen. A week later, Jake showed up again, this time without his uniform, but with the same demeanor as before: too friendly, too close. Aisha tried to remain calm, but Jake's gaze relentlessly pursued her, as if he were looking for a way to get closer. "Hey Aisha, how are you doing today?" he greeted while placing several items on the counter. Aisha answered briefly. "Good, thank you." Jake smiled again, his gaze never leaving Aisha's face. "I just got off work. I'm so tired, but I'm glad I could stop by here." Aisha nodded without speaking. She just wanted Jake to leave quickly, but the man kept talking, as if they were close friends. The conversation began to turn more personal, with Jake asking about Aisha's family, where she lived, whether she had a boyfriend, and so on. Those questions only heightened Aisha's anxiety, but she didn't know how to escape this situation. Jake seemed to revel in Aisha's discomfort. Every time he saw her avoid his gaze, his smile grew wider. "You should relax more, Aisha. You look tense." Aisha swallowed hard, trying to restrain herself from showing her fear. Yet deep down, she knew the situation wouldn't improve. Jake was coming in more often, becoming more intense, and Aisha felt powerless to stop him. It was as if Jake believed he had control over her simply because he was a police officer. And Aisha knew that as long as Jake kept coming around, her life would never be the same again. Days went by in a suffocating silence. Aisha tried to go about her routine as usual, but Jake's shadow haunted her every step. Each sound of the supermarket door opening made her tense. Each customer that walked in made her glance quickly, afraid to see Jake standing there again, smiling in an intimidating way. Aisha began to sleep poorly. Every time she closed her eyes, Jake's shadow would appear in her mind with his piercing gaze that seemed to penetrate her very being. She woke up multiple times in the middle of the night, cold sweat soaking her body. The nightmares continued to plague her, keeping her from shaking the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Aisha knew this was not just ordinary fear. It was more than that. Jake was not just an ordinary customer, he was a real threat that was beginning to destroy Aisha's peace of mind. One night, Aisha decided to talk to her coworker, Rachel. Rachel was another cashier at the supermarket, and Aisha felt she could share her worries, even though Rachel was known for being cheerful and often not thinking about serious things. "Rachel, have you ever felt uncomfortable with one of the customers?" Aisha asked softly, trying not to sound too anxious. Rachel, who was tidying up items on the shelf, raised an eyebrow, looking confused by the question. "Which customer? Do you mean a specific person?" Aisha bit her lip, unsure if this was the right time to open up. But she could no longer keep her fears to herself. "The police officer who has been coming in a lot lately. His name is Jake, I think. He always looks at me in a weird way." Rachel chuckled lightly, as if what Aisha said was just something ordinary. "Oh, him. I know, that handsome cop, right? He often stops by my register too. But I don't feel anything weird. He's always friendly, chats a bit, then leaves." Aisha bit her lip again. Rachel didn't understand. To her, Jake might just be a handsome man in uniform who made some cashiers smile, but Aisha felt something darker in Jake's presence, something Rachel seemed to fail to catch. "I don't know, Rachel. The way he looks at me makes me uncomfortable. Like he's following me or something." Rachel put down the items in her hands and looked at Aisha more seriously now. "Are you sure it's just your feeling? I mean, maybe he just likes you and doesn't know how to approach you." Aisha shook her head, feeling there was something more than just ordinary attraction. "It's not like that, Rachel. I know the difference. Every time he comes in, I feel threatened. He always asks about my personal life, where I live, if I have a boyfriend. That's not normal." Rachel looked surprised to hear this. "Oh, well, that does start to sound a bit creepy. Have you talked to the boss?" Aisha sighed. "Not yet. I don't know what to say. I mean, he's a police officer, Rachel. A person of power. What can our boss do? If I make trouble, I might end up being blamed." Rachel fell silent for a moment, realizing how complicated the situation was. "You're right. Police can make everything harder. But you can't just stay silent, Aisha. If you feel unsafe, you should tell someone. If not the boss, maybe report to another police officer." Aisha smiled bitterly. "Another police officer? They're friends with Jake. Who would believe me? A cashier at a supermarket, going against a police officer." Rachel could only nod awkwardly. "I understand. But if you need help, you can tell me anytime, okay?" Aisha nodded, even though in her heart, she knew that Rachel couldn't really help her. This was a problem bigger than what a cheerful, optimistic coworker could handle. That night after work, Aisha felt something was different. She walked home alone, as usual. The streets in this small town were quite empty at night, with only a few people wandering about. However, tonight, Aisha felt something unusual. It was as if someone was following her. At first, she tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination. She had been too anxious lately because of Jake, so maybe her fear was becoming excessive. But the longer she walked, the clearer it became that someone was indeed watching her. Every time Aisha quickened her pace, she could feel footsteps behind her speeding up too. Her heart raced and her body began to tremble. She didn't want to turn around, afraid to find that her fears were indeed real. Aisha decided to walk faster, almost running now. The road ahead was still empty. There was no one else she could ask for help. Her mind began to race, searching for a way to escape if danger truly approached. As she passed a narrow alley, her panic grew stronger. However, in her panic, Aisha suddenly heard a soft voice behind her. "Where are you going?" That voice, Jake. Aisha turned around, and sure enough, Jake was standing there, a few meters behind her, with the same smile he had in the supermarket. A smile that did not show friendliness, but rather control. Control over Aisha's fear. Jake stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Aisha. "I told you we would meet again. I always know when and where to find you." Aisha swallowed hard, her eyes darting around, searching for an escape route. But all paths seemed blocked. She didn't know where to run, and even if she did, Jake was a police officer. He knew how to chase someone. Jake, you shouldn't be following me. Her voice trembled, even though she tried to remain calm. Jake only let out a small laugh. I'm not following you, Aisha. I just happened to be here. On patrol, his eyes gleamed with a gaze that was unmistakable. He knew Aisha was afraid, and he enjoyed it. Let me go, Jake. I just want to go home. Aisha stepped back, hoping Jake would understand and leave. But Jake only moved closer. I don't intend to hurt you, Aisha. I just want to talk. We can be friends, can't we? Aisha held her breath, trying to find a way to escape. But before she could think of what to do, Jake was too close, too fast. He grabbed Aisha's arm, gripping it tightly, as if she were his possession. We can talk now. Here, without distractions. Aisha felt her body freeze, fear consuming her. Jake pulled her into the dark alley, away from the view of others. In this place in the darkness, Aisha knew no one would hear her scream. No one would come to help. In her heart, Aisha knew that tonight would not end well. That night became a turning point for Aisha. After Jake pulled her into the alley, she felt her world collapse. Her body trembled uncontrollably, and all her strength was spent just trying to stay upright. Jake didn't hit or physically harm her, but the threat in his grip was enough for Aisha to know she was in grave danger. His cold, meaningful smile made her feel like a small mouse caught in the grasp of a cat ready to play with her before finishing her off. That night, Aisha managed to escape, but not without a struggle. As Jake began to squeeze her arm harder, she begged with a trembling voice, almost inaudible due to the fear choking her throat. Jake, please, I just want to go home. You don't need to do this. Jake stared at her for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, he released his grip. Okay, I won't force you, he said, grinning widely, as if he had just spared her life. But remember this, Aisha, you won't be able to keep avoiding me. Aisha slowly backed away, not daring to look at Jake any longer. All she wanted was to run. She wanted to reach her home, close the door, and hope Jake would never come again. As she began to run away from the alley, tears started streaming down her cheeks. The dark night felt increasingly menacing, and each step felt like carrying an unending burden. However, once Aisha reached her apartment, the fear did not dissipate. Even after locking all the doors and turning off all the lights, Jake's shadow lingered in her mind. Her hands still shook as she tried to call anyone to tell them what had just happened. But each time she reached for her phone, she felt that same fear. Who would believe her? Jake was a cop and Aisha was just a cashier. This was not a battle she could easily win. That night, Aisha didn't sleep. She sat in the corner of her bed, staring at the securely locked door, hoping Jake wouldn't come again. But deep down, she knew the threat of Jake was far from over. He would come back. And when he did, he might not be as lenient as he was last night. The next morning, Aisha went to work despite feeling exhausted and her mind still filled with fear. Every sound of footsteps on the supermarket floor made her flinch, terrified it was Jake coming to continue his threats. However, that day, Jake did not appear. Aisha felt a bit relieved, but the anxious feeling remained. Rachel, noticing Aisha looked paler than usual, immediately approached her. Are you okay? She asked, looking intently at Aisha. You look really tired. Aisha tried to smile, but her smile was weak. I didn't sleep well last night. Rachel looked at her longer and Aisha knew she wanted to ask more but didn't push. If you need a break, I can cover your shift. You don't have to force yourself, Aisha. Aisha shook her head slowly. I can't keep running away from this. I have to keep working, or I'll go crazy. Rachel gently patted her shoulder, offering support even though she had no idea what was really going on. But the conversation didn't last long, as customers began to trickle in again, and they both had to return to their duties. That day, Aisha worked like a robot, scanning items, forcing a fake smile, and making small talk with customers. But her mind kept drifting back to the events of the previous night. What would happen if Jake came back? What if he became bolder? Every time the automatic doors of the supermarket opened, Aisha felt her heart leap into her throat. However, Jake didn't show up that day, and perhaps it was his absence that made Aisha more fearful, like the calm before the storm. 2 days passed, and Aisha began to hope that Jake might have forgotten about her. Maybe the threat of that night was just part of his power play, to see how scaredy Aisha could get. But that hope shattered when one afternoon, while the supermarket was relatively quiet, Jake appeared again. This time he wasn't in uniform. Jake came in casual clothes, jeans, and a leather jacket, but his demeanor hadn't changed. As soon as he walked in, his gaze immediately sought out Aisha. He walked slowly toward the cash register, ignoring all the shelves around him, focused only on one thing, Aisha. Aisha felt her blood run cold as she saw Jake approaching. She tried to appear calm, but her body shook. She wanted to run, to hide somewhere, but there was no chance. She had to stay there, working, trying to go through the day as usual, even though the threat before her was becoming more real. "Hey Aisha," Jake greeted in an overly familiar tone. "Haven't seen you in a few days." Aisha could only nod slightly, not daring to look at Jake for too long. "Yeah, I've been busy," she replied curtly, hoping Jake would leave soon. But Jake had no intention of leaving. He placed a couple of trivial items on the counter, a bottle of water and a chocolate bar, and continued to gaze at Aisha with an intense look. "I've been busy too, but I always make time to drop by and see you." Aisha felt her stomach churn. She wanted to say something, to ask him to stop coming, but the words got stuck in her throat. She knew Jake wouldn't stop just because she asked. He enjoyed this game, relishing the fear radiating from Aisha. Meanwhile, Rachel, working at the adjacent register, watched their interaction with concern. Even though Aisha hadn't shared all the details about Jake, Rachel could sense something was wrong. Jake's gaze was too intense, and Aisha clearly wasn't comfortable. Rachel tried to signal with her eyes, offering help if needed, but Aisha could only shake her head slightly, as if she had resigned herself to the situation. After a few minutes that felt like hours, Jake finally paid for his items and left. But before he stepped outside, he turned back once more. "We should talk longer next time, Aisha. Don't be too busy, okay?" Aisha didn't respond, just looked down, hoping he wouldn't see the fear etched on her face. As soon as Jake left, Aisha exhaled deeply, as if she had just survived an attack. Rachel quickly approached. "Aisha, you need to report him. This is getting out of hand." Aisha looked at Rachel with tired, anxious eyes. "To whom, Rachel?" "He's a cop. Who's going to listen to me?" Rachel looked both confused and angry at the same time. "This can't be left unchecked. We need to find a way out of this." But Aisha wasn't sure there was a way out. Every day, Jake got closer, and Aisha knew it was only a matter of time before he took a more dangerous step. And when that time came, Aisha might not be able to run anymore. Every day after her last encounter with Jake, Aisha felt something terrifying closing in, like a shadow growing darker. She couldn't escape the feeling that every step she took, every movement of her body was being scrutinized. Her entire routine turned into a circle of paranoia. When she woke up in the morning, her body felt heavy, not from exhaustion, but from the relentless burden of fear gnawing at her mind. Every time Aisha opened the door to her apartment, her eyes immediately swept the entire corridor, ensuring that Jake wasn't hiding around one of the corners. Outside, the usually busy and familiar street now felt like a place full of threats. Each person walking near her seemed like a potential danger. Every car that slowed down felt like it was watching her. At work, the situation was worse. The supermarket, which should have been her safe haven, turned into a stage where she was constantly on high alert. The automatic doors opening and closing became signals of danger, as if behind every customer entering, Jake was there to start his new game. Rachel, increasingly worried about Aisha's state, kept pushing her to take more concrete steps. One afternoon, while they were on break in the back room, Rachel tried to convince her again. "Aisha, you can't keep living like this. Every time he comes in, I can see you're terrified. You need to report him. This can't go on." Aisha stared at Rachel with a blank expression, tired and filled with despair. "Report to who, Rachel?" "He's a cop. I've told you they won't believe me. And if Jake finds out I reported him, I don't know what he'll do." Rachel stepped closer to Aisha, placing her hand on her friend's shoulder. "If you keep letting him feel powerful, he'll become bolder. We don't know how far he'll go." Aisha could only nod weakly. Rachel's words were true, but the reality she faced was not simple. She could report Jake, but the risks involved were too high. Jake knew where she worked, he knew where Aisha lived, and worse, he was a police officer. Aisha felt like a pawn in a game controlled by Jake, and every step she took could lead to her own destruction. A few days later, the situation reached a boiling point. Aisha had felt something was wrong since she arrived at the supermarket. The air felt heavier than usual, and fewer customers seemed to be coming in. Everything felt like a bad omen, but Aisha couldn't pinpoint where her discomfort was coming from. Just before lunchtime, the supermarket door opened, and Jake walked in. However, this time he was not alone. He came with two other police officers and walked directly toward the cashier counter, where Aisha was standing. Aisha's heart nearly stopped as she watched them approach. What was this? Did they know? Had Jake concocted a story that could destroy her? Jake smiled as he reached Aisha. Hey Aisha. Just stopping by for a moment. These are my friends, we're taking a break. Aisha felt her throat dry up. She couldn't say anything. The other two officers seemed casual, as if they were just accompanying a friend. But to Aisha, their presence was a clear message. Jake could come at any time, with anyone, and he had the power to intimidate her whenever he wanted. Are you okay? Jake asked in an overly friendly tone, but Aisha could sense the veiled threat behind his words. You look tired. Aisha forced a smile. I'm fine. Jake nodded with a satisfied expression, then paid for his items before turning to leave with his two friends. But before he exited the supermarket, Jake glanced back at Aisha one more time, his eyes glinting with something darker. See you later, Aisha. After Jake and his friends left, Aisha felt her legs go weak. She had to grip the cashier's desk to keep her balance. Her whole body shook violently, and she felt nauseous. Rachel, who had witnessed the encounter from a distance, rushed over. Aisha, you can't keep going like this, Rachel said, her voice panicked. This is insane. You need to talk to someone. Aisha shook her head, tears starting to streak down her cheeks. Rachel. I can't. I'm scared. Rachel looked frustrated, but she knew this wasn't easy. We have to seek help. Maybe not the police, but we need to do something before it gets worse. But Aisha remained silent. She knew Rachel was right, but her fear was greater than her courage to take action. The following days were heavy for Aisha. Jake continued to come to the supermarket more frequently. Each time he came, there was a clear pattern. He never said anything harsh or too direct. Just a cold smile and greetings that confirmed he was playing a psychological game with Aisha. The more often Jake came, the more trapped Aisha felt. He didn't need to touch her or threaten her with words. His mere presence was enough to shatter Aisha's peace. Rachel, who could no longer bear to see her friends suffer, took the initiative herself. One afternoon, when Aisha left early due to stress, Rachel approached the supermarket manager, a middle-aged man named Mr. Watson, who rarely got directly involved with his cashiers. Mr. Watson. I need to talk, Rachel said seriously. Mr. Watson, who was busy checking sales reports, looked up in surprise. What is it, Rachel? You look serious. Rachel took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. It's about one of the customers, sir. He's a police officer and he comes here often. But he's making Aisha, my friend, uncomfortable. More than that, he seems to be harassing and threatening her. Mr. Watson stared at Rachel with a dubious expression. A police officer? Harassing? Has he done anything illegal? Rachel shook her head, knowing her answer wouldn't be satisfactory. Not illegal, sir. But he always comes in, always looks at Aisha in a way that's not normal. Then Aisha's very scared. I just want you to do something before this gets worse. Mr. Watson sighed and then sat up straight. Rachel, you know how sensitive situations like this are, right? We're talking about a police officer, not an ordinary customer. I can't just accuse him without real evidence. If he hasn't done something clearly wrong, my hands are tied. Rachel felt frustrated, but she knew this wasn't an easy answer. But Aisha is really scared, sir. I'm just afraid that later, it might be too late. Mr. Watson looked at Rachel with a thoughtful expression, but ultimately shook his head. I will keep an eye on the situation, Rachel. But for now, I can't do anything. Rachel left Mr. Watson's office feeling desperate. She knew Aisha wouldn't report it herself, and without action from the supermarket, Jake would keep coming. And if Jake became bolder, who knew what would happen to Aisha? The next few days dragged on heavily for Aisha. Jake appeared more frequently at work, sometimes just standing near the entrance, as if watching her. His presence made Aisha feel like she was locked in a prison without walls. She couldn't go anywhere without fearing that Jake would be there. That night, Aisha returned to her apartment earlier than usual. Her body was weary, and her mind was becoming more chaotic. She felt something was off, a strange feeling that pressed down on her with every passing second. Aisha approached her bedroom window, looking outside with deep anxiety. And there, under the dim streetlight, she saw him. Jake was standing outside her apartment, staring straight at her window. His face showed no expression, but his cold gaze was enough to make Aisha's heart nearly stop. There was no more room to run. Jake had found her, and now he wouldn't let Aisha forget